Hello and welcome to the Society for the Environment's latest webinar and the start of a brand new 5-part series with the umbrella topic of natural capital in your business. This is now the 7th series of expert-led cross-disciplinary webinars that we have hosted. If you want to look back at previous webinar series, then head to our website, which is on your screen now. This series will look into the theory of natural capital, how it should be implemented, examples of good practice and insights into how it can benefit both the environment and business. Before we go any further, I have a few housekeeping notes regarding the webinar platform that we are using today, which is Zoom. The main thing to know is that you can direct questions to our special guest speaker today via the Q&A option in your toolbar at any time throughout the webinar. The toolbar is likely to be at the foot of your screen. If you can't see the toolbar currently, just hover over the bottom of your screen and you should be able to see it. It should appear. Once located, tap your question into the Q&A text box provided and click or tap submit. I will then pick those questions up and we'll run through those after we've heard from Vicky today and her insights that she has. Secondly, you are all on mute. As with all of our webinars, this is nothing against you. It just helps the webinar run smoothly without any distractions or background noise. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in the coming days via our website, YouTube channel, and if you have opted in to receive emails from us when you registered for the webinar, then you will receive an email with the recording link. So my name is Phil Underwood. I am the engagement manager here at the Society for the Environment. You don't particularly need to know much about me, but if you have any questions following the webinar, then it's worth jotting down my email address or phone number, and I will be able to either answer them myself if it's about registration, so chartership and so on, or if it's about natural capital, then it will certainly be Vicky that might be able to answer those questions, not me. As a way of an introduction to ourselves, very quickly, you are watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold the professional registers for environmental professionals. So we have the Chartered Environmentalist Register, or REnvTech. In order to become a CM, you will need to be a member of and apply via one of these 24 professional bodies. You can become an REnvTech via 3 of these professional bodies, which are now highlighted on your screen. I shall leave these logos on the screen for a moment. If you want to find out any more about CM or REnvTech registration, then please visit socenv.org.uk or inquire with the relevant professional body directly. They can point you in the right direction for more information, provide guidance, and many of them can arrange a mentor as well. So definitely worth getting in touch with those if you're thinking about that. Okay, that's quite enough from me for now. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Vicky Betts, who is a Chartered Environmentalist via IEMA, and that's the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. And she is the Senior Advisor for Economic Appraisal at the Environment Agency. For those who don't know, the Environment Agency covers England, but also works with its counterparts or bordering counterparts, and shares its expert knowledge across continents as well. So certainly the right people to be talking about this particular topic today. So welcome, Vicky. Thank you very much for joining us. Are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thanks very much, Phil.
Excellent, excellent. Vicky will be exploring a bit of the history of natural capital and the concept that it is. Then how this way of thinking and measuring change can be a powerful tool in the quest for more sustainable decisions, before discussing a few common pitfalls as well. So I'm going to hand over to Vicky in just a second, but a quick reminder for those who've now joined us since my introduction. Please use the Q&A option in your toolbar at any stage throughout the webinar, and I will ask those questions to Vicky after her talk. So, Vicky, for the next 30 minutes or so, it's over to you, if that's okay.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us. So, natural capital in 2020. Well, this really has been an extraordinary year, hasn't it? Got nature in the time of the pandemic. And personally, when lockdown hit, the great outdoors, certainly for me, became a refuge from cabin fever. It's always been a good indicator of keeping myself fit and well. But it was great to see that more people than ever seemed to be out in the fresh air. Everybody was out. The spaces that I used regularly were full of people. I thought, brilliant. As an environmentalist, obviously I celebrated that. So surely more people would be connecting and appreciating our natural assets, and because they were now benefiting from them more directly. And you know, we're always told that if you use something, then you develop a love for it and a willingness to protect it. And then I started to see the extra litter piling up, the face masks, the gloves, the plastic picnic things. People were going to these spaces and they were ruining the very thing that they decided they valued enough to spend their 1 hour a day outside of their house at. So clearly people's behaviours and decisions are not necessarily being driven by that rational self-interest, as many traditional economists would have us believe that they are. So in summary, really, we need to recognise that value and valuation are far more complicated than we might have thought in the past. Now, going into the history of natural capital, some of the originators of it, some ecological economists called Herman Daly and Robert Costanza, they describe natural capital and the environmental degradation that we see these days as a bit of an accounting problem. So in the past, the drawdown of natural resources from the assets that we have was treated as income in GDP rather than consumption of an asset. And because it was treated as free income, it really wasn't monitored or valued. And likewise, the wastes and pollutions that resulted from production processes and from human activity just been treated as externalities from the market. So they weren't reflected in the price of goods and services. But it was just treated as something that happened outside. So the idea that we all exist within the one planetary system really wasn't embedded into economics. And so instead of seeing that pollution, those wastes as depreciations, as negative impacts and costs to the system, they were just kind of left floating there as something for somebody else to worry about. So the idea with natural capital really is to recognise that, you know, actually natural capital is the limiting factor in all economic activity or production, and of course it's the limiting factor in all life on Earth. In the olden days, the world was quite empty, relatively few human beings, relatively a large amount of planet and natural resources. And it's understandable that the early economists thought that this was a limitless resource that, you know, we couldn't possibly have any kind of impact on because of the change of scale. However, as the number of us have grown and our impact has grown and we've become more globalised, the world is effectively a lot smaller. And we're seeing now the cumulative impacts of all of those wastes and pollution. We're seeing climate change, you know, heading for 4 degrees temperature rise. We're seeing biodiversity loss, where we're looking at perhaps 58% declines just in the UK. It's absolutely shocking what is happening to the planet, all because we've kind of overlooked the impact that we might have because we thought, you know, we couldn't possibly be that big. And it turns out we are. So natural capital is going to limit everything that we can do in the future and constrain that, unless we start to manage it a bit better. So there's an idea then about a level of sustainable use of natural capital, and that's dependent on the quantity of natural assets that we have, the quality that those natural assets are. You can have all the water in the world that you want, but unless it's of drinkable quality, it's very little help to you in sustaining people. We also need to think about the regeneration rate of things. So perhaps you can have sustainable growth of forests for trees and paper, but things like oil and fossil fuels do not regenerate at the rate that we're extracting them. So that again feeds into this idea of regeneration rate. So we're quite clear that we've got all of these constraints now on natural capital, and so we need to do something to make sure that we're actually taking things into account where we haven't in the past. But the idea of natural capital essentially was that when people were making decisions, all of these impacts we just discussed, the inputs and the outputs, these things were invisible in the decisions that were being made. So the value of the goods, the services, the benefits and the opportunities that were provided to us for free, essentially, by the natural world were either ignored completely or given very one-dimensional values, so only valued through what they were worth in economic markets, so what you could buy and sell them for. So it was a very, very simplistic way of capturing value, and that meant that there was an awful lot of invisible value there. This invisible value has led to a loss of natural assets and the goods and services that they provide, which has left us poorer overall. And obviously, as we discussed, this is having dire consequences for well-being and perhaps the future survival of life on this planet. We really need to do something about this idea of invisible value. So how might we take these things into account in decisions better? Well, the first step is to make this invisible value visible again. And that's what natural capital aims to do. So although it's all a bit theoretical, so maybe let's bring it home to a concrete example. So this is my local wood. This is where I spend a lot of time walking my dogs and getting my daily dose of nature. If you look at it in terms of the assets, the natural assets, we have about 84 hectares of deciduous native woodland. We've got sandstone bedrock, which is important in Yorkshire for all sorts of building and construction. And there's also a number of natural springs in there. So you've got those three main types of assets. Those assets provide us with a bunch of natural services, these ecosystem services that we're becoming more and more familiar with. So things like the storage of carbon in the trees and the soil, the biodiversity. So there's tons of birds and bugs and small mammals running around in there. It helps to regulate the climate. You walk in and out of the wood and the temperature drops. It's quite remarkable on some days. It helps to regulate water flows, as I say, the streams and springs flowing through it, but also all of those trees help to catch rainfall and allow it to percolate into the ground slowly rather than running off and causing a problem in local rivers. And it also helps to clean the air. So we've got those natural services that happen, and these things don't really require any interaction with people. But this woodland is just not just the sum of its natural assets and its spaces. It also has cultural importance. There's an awful lot of history in this woodland. If you look around, you can find prehistoric cupstone carvings. It's previously in the 16 to 1800s. It's been used for coppice and grazing. There's been building stone quarries here, and many of the local houses and walls and gardens are made out of the stone that was quarried in this area. There's been part of a grand old estate, so there's a walled garden and even a relic old outdoor swimming pool in there. It was a reservoir at one point in the 1800s for some local schools. When it came to the middle of the 20th century, then it was somewhere where our troops trained for the D-Day landing, because the woodland was thought to resemble Normandy quite strongly. And later on, it became briefly a prisoner of war camp for Italian soldiers. Later on, after the war, there was a fireworks factory there until there were too many fireworks accidents. Unfortunately, some people were killed and the firework factory shut down. And there's even stories about ghosts from the 1600s, terrible murderers who are kept at bay now because of holly that grows in Calverley Woods and helps to contain that. So an awful lot of history there. In the modern day, it's very much used by the community, so it's there for people to walk in, but I also see people bouldering, a lot of mountain bikers. It's a great place for bird watching, fell running, running around up and down the hills. But it's a workplace too. The local dog walking businesses go there quite often. And it's also an art gallery. There's a local stone carving artist in the last few years has been going around finding lumps of rocks and carving things like this magnificent dragon's head that you can see. These have appeared all over the woodland and added a new level of interest. But over lockdown, it's taken on even more values. It's become a safe meeting space, an outdoor meeting space where people could still interact with the people that they care about without breaking any of those distancing rules. It's become a health spa and a gym, somewhere where people can relax and get more exercise. It's been a school. I've seen families out there, parents with their children, homeschooling them about the natural world. And the most magical thing that's sprung up is a fairy village. It started with 1 or 2 tiny huts, and then before you knew it, all of the local families were coming and they built this enormous fairy village, helping children to engage with the natural world, using natural resources and creating something really magical for the future. So there's so many layered values here. And if you were to look just at those initial assets of deciduous native woodland, sandstone and springs, you would miss so much of the value and the meaning to the local community. So let's go into some of the economic language that you might have heard. If we're going to treat this like an economic problem and use this economic metaphor of capital, what does that actually mean? So in economics, capital is a physical stock or perhaps a fund that yields a flow of useful goods or services over time and into the future. We can see that then we have a stock of natural assets. And so, as I say, those were the things that I was describing earlier in the woodland, the sandstone, the woodland itself, and the springs that are in there. There is also an idea of critical natural capital. So not all natural capital is equal. There is a certain type and a certain amount that is absolutely essential for life to perpetuate. We have to protect that critical natural capital at all costs, because there's no substitute for it. There's no technology that can do for us all of the things that nature can do. So the idea of critical natural capital, you might also hear. So once we've got our stock of natural assets, we receive some flows from them. So we receive a flow of natural resources, which goes into production processes, creates the products and also the wastes that we might be used to. Those can be termed provisioning ecosystem services. They provide us with goods. So a perfect example is where you've got a woodland, a sustainable woodland that's grown to provide timber or paper pulp. That provides a flow of natural resources, and as long as it's managed sustainably, that asset will continue to provide that flow and we'll be able to have the products that we need without the asset itself being eaten away or depreciated or lost. But there's a much wider flow of what has been termed ecosystem service benefits. So these are all of those other things. So these natural resource flows, those are the ones that have traditionally been captured in markets and quite easily reflected in decision making. So somebody might have looked at that woodland, thought about how much money they could make out of the timber and whether it was worth clearing it and selling it off, or perhaps selling the land for housing, as was planned at one point in its history. But the ecosystem service benefits are there to capture a lot of this invisible value. So all of those other things that you will never know were going on, whether that's the natural processes that we were talking about in terms of carbon storage or biodiversity, or whether it's those cultural services, those cultural ecosystem services that allow us to connect as people to a place and to have a sense of our own history and a place in the world. So we have 4 different types of ecosystem services. We have our provisioning services, so those are your traditional market benefits. We have our regulating services and supporting services, And these are the ones which are built around more natural processes. So you can have a regulation of flows of water that we talked about, where rainfall is attenuated, or we can have supporting services like the microbes that are in the soil that are breaking things down, storing carbon, and turning the rocks into soil to support the woodland itself. And then these cultural ecosystem services, which are the ones that are very much usually impossible to capture in markets, because they're about how people connect to, relate to, and feel about their natural assets, as well as this sense of history and spiritual value that can be connected there, and the aesthetic values as well that we get. We all know that nature is beautiful. Natural capital doesn't exist on its own. You'll hear either 4, 5, 6, sometimes different forms of capital talked about. The important thing is the way that these different capitals combine together to create sustainable human well-being. You can't just jump from natural capital straight to well-being. There's an interaction that happens. So we get the flow of ecosystem services from natural capital that interacts with social capital, which is our networks and our trust between each other, and our social norms and ideas of how things should be. Our human capital, our individual skills and knowledge, and our man-made built capital. These things come together to give us what we need for a good life. But it's really important to understand that these things don't exist as a set of equal pillars. Natural capital is our planet, it's our home, and everything else is nested within the boundaries of that. And so you might have heard of things like planetary boundaries and those limits. And the idea is that natural capital sets those limits on the planetary boundaries. Then we have our society nested within that, and within that is the economy. And that's the way that you should think about these things. I think historically, perhaps the economy has tried to nest everything else within that. But we know that the constraining factor on economic activity and all of our well-being is these limits, this boundary of natural capital. So remember how things are nested together. Now let's go on to the valuation aspect of it. Valuation is always the bit that starts to make people feel uncomfortable sometimes, particularly if they're from more of an environmental background. But in the absence of the win-win that we all seek for in an ideal world, we do have to make choices, and often those choices deliver trade-offs. Anything that we do in our daily lives where we make a choice, choosing one thing or action over another, implies that actually a valuation has taken place. The one thing that you have chosen to do has been more highly valued by you than the alternatives that could have been done. Somewhere along the line, there has been a process to weigh up the costs and benefits of the different activities, and a choice has been made. So valuation is not the same as monetization, as putting a pound sign on things. Valuation, appraisal, these decision-making processes of weighing up pros and cons, costs and benefits happen all the time. You must do it hundreds of times a day. So we actually do a lot of valuation. And so perhaps the idea of valuation in the natural world and the decisions about how we use and plan our land and how we try and make sustainable transitions needs to have an element of systematic valuation built into it too. So we've got this idea of valuation, but we also need to recognise how complicated value is. As we saw, there's people going out enjoying nature more during this pandemic, but unfortunately some of us are finding a very deep connection to it, a very spiritual connection, and others are finding it's somewhere that they can just go and use and pollute and leave. Value is objective. So for example, I could have a ring, and that ring could be sold at a jeweller's for a particular amount. However, value is also subjective. That ring to me is more than the value of the objective ring, of the objective sale value, because it's been passed down my family for 100 years. So that's my value that's attached to it, as well as its objective value. But value is also relative. So were I to compare keeping hold of that ring or keeping hold of my dogs, I would say that the ring then becomes of little value at all, despite all of its objective and subjective values. Were I to compare it to something else which I value far more, then the ring loses essentially value. So value itself is a very complicated and layered thing. That means that it's quite poorly understood, especially by individuals, and more so when you're talking about the value of the natural world. Something that is very, very hard to get this idea of what it might be worth, because we don't tend to buy and sell it. It's around us all day. It feels like our endowment, and it's something that we hope to take care of because it takes care of us. So value is complex as well as being complicated. So you can't just necessarily add up all of the individual parts and hope to truly capture value. There's something else that might come together as well. And that's, perhaps most clearly captured in those cultural ecosystem services. People really struggle with thinking about the long-term implications. So we think very much along horizons of the next few weeks, the next few months, perhaps the next few years. We struggle to think longer than maybe, the span of our lifetime, and certainly not over hundreds and thousands of years. So the long-term implications of our decisions get very difficult for us to grasp. And that's the root really of a lot of the problems around climate change, as it's been happening at such a rate that people can't wrap their heads around the urgency of it, because it seems slow to us, even though to the planet it's incredibly rapid. In traditional economics, we've got an idea that people are rational. We've got access to all of the information in the world. We weigh all of that up and we make one fixed set of preferences, one fixed set of choices on the basis of that. But we know actually that people's preferences shift and change. So you might make a decision in January that you're going to join a gym and you're going to go every single week and you're going to lose a ton of weight and get yourself in shape and feel great. But by the time it's March, you're not going anymore. And that's because your preferences for what you're going to do has shifted. Our preferences when it comes to the value of things also shift. And so because value is relative, then we get this shift as well as to how things are valued in different contexts. So those ecological economists that I talked about before, Robert Costanza, he thinks that we need to have some really broad goals if we're going to talk about valuation of the natural world, of natural capital. He describes these three goals that we need to be looking at. These goals have different sets of preferences which relate to them. They need different processes in order to examine them and capture them, and they've got different valuation methods. So if we want to look at economic efficiency, for example, then we would probably look at current individual preferences. We wouldn't really need to talk to people all that much. We could just do a study and then get the detail out of it. We don't need a lot of people from different disciplines involved. We might capture that in something like a willingness to pay study. Those willingness to pay values could then be used to, as they are in my world, value improvements in the quality of water over different lengths of kilometres if we do different types of interventions. And that helps us decide how we manage the water environment. But there's another goal that we need to look at, and that's actually fairness. And so this comes into the idea that people and nature are connected. We can't just make decisions for either one set of people or for, who might have been reflected in our willingness to pay study. And it's not usually helpful to go ahead and do one thing without consulting with stakeholders or partners or anybody who might be affected by these decisions. So we try and gather the preferences of communities, but that takes a lot of time. Obviously, you need to spend a lot of time discussing this, getting people to talk, this discursive process where everybody discusses and decides what their values are. You need some scientific input and evidence to try and support those discussions and help people to understand things that perhaps are new to them, like the idea of natural capital is to most people. And then there's different types of valuation methods that you might want to capture those. You're trying to capture the whole community's preference at once. So there's a mythical veil of ignorance where you get people to try and vote as if they don't have any preferences of their own. Methodology called Q, where you can rank things and rate things in different combinations. Or multi-criteria decision analysis, if it's done systematically and done well, can be a really powerful tool in this kind of ecological economic approach. There's also a sustainability goal. Now that exists at the whole system level, wherever you might choose to draw the boundaries of a system, which is probably a webinar in itself. There needs to be a lot of discussion around that. You need an awful lot of scientific input, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty in understanding how these systems work, particularly, as we said, over the long term. So they recommend, you would use modelling and perhaps scenarios, but those need to be used in a precautionary way, where you can understand all of the uncertainties and the thresholds and the complex interactions that might happen. So the strengths and weaknesses of your models and the different assumptions that are in there. But those are different ways that you can capture different types of value, and these types of value all exist at the same time. These goals need to be knitted together. So we'll come on to the bit that always tends to get people wound up, and that's the idea of monetization as part of your valuation. The way to think about monetization is it's about trying to get very, very different things into one set of units. And those units are either pounds or dollars, whatever currency it is that you're valuing them in. Now, people like George Monbiot that you can see there, he levels an awful lot of criticisms at this approach. Says that nature should be valued for its intrinsic value, that these approaches are about buying and selling nature, turning it into a commodity which only has a value in relation to people. Says that it perpetuates the idea that the natural world is replaceable when it's not, and to start adopting all of these economic metaphors when the enemy of big business is out there that's driving all of these problems. Adopting your enemy's framing means you will never ever win the argument. But anybody who's in the natural capital world who really, really gets this concept, so people like Herman Daly there, and on the right, Bob Costanza, as well as a lot of the coalitions and the committees, have some pretty sound and reasonable counters to these kind of arguments. So putting a monetization value on it, costing up impacts on nature, and looking at nature in terms of its interaction with people, its value to people, exists also alongside intrinsic value. It doesn't replace it. So it's also got a costed value alongside an intrinsic value. We're not talking about replacing one or the other. These are ecological economists who want nothing more than to perpetuate the planet in a good state for the future. So monetization lets you symbolize a lot of these values, these invisible values that have been left out of decisions. If you don't find a way to symbolize all of that value and bring it into your decision-making framework, then we end up with the problem that we started with, where if you can't capture that value simply, it'll be given a value of 0 and ignored. So you may say that this perpetuates the idea that we can buy and sell or commodify nature, but most ecosystem services are what we call public goods. We can't exclude anybody from using them. They're out there, we can access them. So we're talking about things like, fresh air. It doesn't matter if I breathe the fresh air, you can still breathe the fresh air, and nobody else can stop me breathing the fresh air, unless they lock me up, obviously. So these things are public goods. If we could capture them and buy and sell them, then pretty certain somebody would have done it by now. We know that critical natural capital is not replaceable, and we've got that idea embedded within the natural capital idea. And so we want to make sure that there is enough natural capital here to sustain us and to sustain life on this planet, including all the biodiversity that we need to make all of these functions work. And finally, just thinking about anybody else who's out there who's got an impact on the natural world as the enemy really isn't helpful. And metaphors, which is essentially what natural capital is. It's an economic metaphor for how we might achieve sustainable management of the natural world. Using metaphors is a really common way to connect with others, because you tap into their existing mental models and framings, and that allows people to latch onto new concepts, pick them up, learn them, and take them on board a lot more easily. So you can see that there is a debate there, but for every argument, there is a strong counter-argument. And it's like anything. If you're going to take an approach to anything, you can do it badly or you can do it well. And done well, this can really, really be a powerful tool for us. So let's get a bit down closer to home. So when you're thinking about, am I going to take a natural capital approach in this next set of decisions that I've got to make, you've got to think about the motivation for taking it on. Different motivations, we know from research, actually lead to different CSR outcomes. So your corporate sustainability outcomes are going to change depending on whether you go into it with an idea that, you know, you're going to, for all intents and purposes, greenwash your business and tap into people's preferences for sustainable products, or whether you're genuinely talking to your board about the idea of leaving a better legacy behind for your company, your corporation, or your organisation. Different motivations will give you these different outcomes. So when you're taking it on board, when you're thinking, am I going to use natural capital, think about what you're trying to achieve. How will the results of your natural capital approach be used? What's it going to drive? Are the outputs that you're designing or creating going to be able to influence the decisions that you need to influence effectively? And if not, how can you adapt them to make sure that they meet the needs of the decision makers that you're trying to reach? And usually, because these approaches involve lots of people, you need to be prepared to share power. But if you share power around things and share that decision-making power, you tend to gain partners as well, and you get more done for less in the long run. Practical uses for a natural capital approach. First and foremost, it can be used as a communication tool. So making all of those invisible values visible. It's really important that we can help people to understand their dependence and their connection to nature, because it's something that as human beings, unless you're in the field of environmental science, you probably take for granted. Like the most valuable things in our lives, the things that we have every day that we depend on, we do tend to take for granted. So you can bring these values and these connections to people's attention and show them that actually this plot of land is more than just a hectareage of space to be sold. You can use natural capital approaches to monitor change. This is a really, really strong argument for using natural capital. So using things like accounts and scorecards. So perhaps your organisation has assets, natural assets and land holdings. Rather than leaving those out of your corporate accounts, you can now measure them in an account tool. And alongside your financial accounting, every year you can report on your natural capital accounts as well and see whether those assets that you own that are nature-based rather than financial are depreciating or appreciating and adding more value. You can use it for options appraisal. So perhaps you have a choice of two different things that you might do with a different plot of land. And those land use decisions, you can use different amounts of evidence to work out what would be the better choice there, what would be the optimum choice, or what are the pros and cons of different paths. So you can use it to systematically work through options and then decide on how you might use different parts of the land, different natural capital assets. You can use it therefore to design in sustainability to projects. If you've got to create a new man-made asset, is there a way that you can use natural capital approach to help you to design that in a more sensitive, more environmentally friendly way, some way that delivers multiple benefits from that thing, so it can carry out its primary function, which perhaps is a water treatment works, but it can also enhance the area, providing access for people, or providing green spaces and a biodiversity reserve if you want to keep people out of there, and provide that nature-based stepping stone. So you can improve these things so that they can meet current needs, but also meet future needs, and finding ways to deliver on these multiple benefits. And finally, this is one that gains the most attention really, is finding ways to stimulate investment into protecting and improving the natural environment. There's things like offsets and credits where businesses might want to purchase a certain amount of carbon offsets in order to carry on with their business processes, and there's those emissions that are absolutely essential to their business. We can use it through things like net gain, environmental net gain, biodiversity net gain, using systematic metrics to work out where we can compensate and add more than compensating when we can't avoid certain impacts. We can look at payments for ecosystem services. So it may be that in future, rather than farming turnips, we might want to pay a farmer to farm carbon for us. And we would pay for that ecosystem service because it become more valuable to us than the turnips that we would have got. It can be used for insurance purposes. So a lot of insurance companies, particularly around things like flood risk, will find that it's cheaper to invest in building the resilience of a catchment rather than to reduce flood risk downstream, rather than to keep paying out quite so much in insurance claims. So the insurance industry can be there as an investor in nature. And then there's a whole raft of different green finance initiatives as well. And I'm sure you'll hear some more about particular examples of how these things have been used and how they've been done through the rest of the webinar series. There are a whole bunch of tools out there to help you do the job. So natural capital might be more popular than ever, but it's not new. It's been going on for a while. So there's an awful lot of stuff that's been built up. There's a great resource which has just been launched. That's called ENCA. That's from DEFRA and the Environment Agency, and that's enabling a natural capital approach. So ENCA has got completely free open access guidance, a really thorough guidance document which talks you through all the different ways that you might go about using and putting into place a natural capital approach. There's assessment templates on there. There's data books with different values that you can use for different ecosystem services and different types of assets. There's a bunch of featured tools on there, so off-the-shelf, ready-to-use tools. And of course, those case studies, which will really help you get your head around how you might want to use these approaches, different ways that they've been put into practice before, and inspire you to try and find the right solution for the problem at hand for you. There's also the Ecosystems Knowledge Network, which is a great knowledge exchange forum. They've worked with various amounts of scientists and policymakers for a very long time now, and developed a huge wealth of information that you can access there. There's the Natural Capital Committee in the UK, which has released reports as well as a workbook on how to do it. There's then the Natural Capital Coalition, which is a separate collective of primarily private sector bodies who've been using natural capital, so showing how they can implement this to really add value to their business and to exploit future opportunities and to be more sustainable, both in an environmental sense, but in terms of and making sure that their business is going to survive in the long run too. In terms of documents that you might want to dig into to understand more richly the concepts and the reasons and the ways that things have been done, there's the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was done in 2005, which looked across the globe. Over 3,000 scientists worked in different scales across the globe to look at what was the state of the world's ecosystems, what direction were the different trends affecting them going, and how much had been lost, so that we could really start to describe the impact of all of that invisible value being lost. We also did that in the UK at a UK scale, so there's a UK National Ecosystems Assessment as well, and a huge follow-on project which looked at all sorts of different values. And of course, you've got this webinar series, which is going to give you a great introduction to a lot of different speakers who've used natural capital in a different way to really problem solve and start to create a better future. So the tools are out there. So let's have a summary now. Time to sum up. So working with others, really, the things to take away from this, working with others is rarely a nice to do. It may be that you have an isolated asset that nobody goes anywhere near, and how you manage it is totally up to you. But remember that you do exist within a wider context, and so there might be other people out there who could help you or who will be affected. So cutting people out of decisions about the things that they value means that you could end up alienating either potential investors of time or effort, if you've got management or change processes you need to go through. And you might even alienate potential investors of money that could have helped you achieve shared goals. Involving people, though, I can't stress this enough, takes time, but it's worth it. It's worth putting that time in. These people that you work with could help you to overcome any sort of obstructions to your plans and will help build a great reputation for your business and organisation, as well as bring their knowledge, their human capital and their skills to it. But most importantly, it's the right thing to do. You know, if these things are going to affect other people, then bringing them on board is really the right thing to do. So you need to think about building the social capital, those trusts, those networks that we rely on if we want to actually protect and improve natural capital. The next thing as a takeaway is that value is plural. That means that, you know, there's not just one truth out there that you can pin it on. It's not that kind of thing. So you need a layered approach to valuation that's done with different people if you want to get close to capturing that true value of natural capital. Without this, if you're just choosing the simplest, quickest, easiest option, then the likelihood is that you're just going to repeat all of those mistakes of the past, where the real value of natural capital is being left out of your decisions. If you want to capture all of these wider values, then put the effort in. You'll get more than that back. Remember that when you're doing valuation as well, that monetization is not your enemy, but nor is it essential. It depends on what you're trying to do. If it's really clear once you've had a discussion with everybody what the option should be and which direction you all agree you want to go, you don't need to spend all of the time and effort on monetizing things if you've already selected the most effective option. So don't be afraid of monetization. It can be a great way to do things like drawing investment, where you are actually talking about bringing in financial things, but it's not essential to making decisions. It depends on the choices to be made, and it depends on who you're trying to influence to make those decisions. Final takeaway as well is to never forget the uncertainty that's involved and to make sure that you take that into account in decisions. Our understanding of the natural world grows every day, but there is still so much we don't know and we don't understand. The world is a complex and complicated place. And thank goodness, because it provides us with endless inspiration for being so. So what's left out may be as important as what's been included. So again, if you go for the easy route where you only adopt certain bits into your natural capital appraisal, so perhaps you rely solely on remote data, then the chances are you're going to be undervaluing your natural capital. You don't want to do that. If you're using any sort of models in there or economic appraisals, make sure that you're testing for sensitivities and tipping points in your valuations. What happens when you change your input parameters? What happens to the outputs? Does it mean that, for example, if the costs that you've estimated were to double, are you still going to make the same decision at the end of that? Or is there's something in there that you need to pay attention to that you can add onto your risk log and helps you to manage the process? So explore a range of possible scenarios. Discussing uncertainties, particularly with large and diverse groups, can lead to all sorts of creative new ideas coming to the fore. and in the long run can build more resilient solutions to these complex problems. So make sure that you use the wealth of evidence that's out there when you're taking a natural capital approach, and you can boost your triple bottom line. So you're talking about your environmental and your social outcomes as well as your business financial outcomes. You can make things better. And so if you approach this with the best motivations, so that's these ideas of wanting to change the world for the better, change your business for the better, then you'll see better outcomes, you'll see the best outcomes. So the tools are out there. What can I say? Get cracking. There's no time like the present. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Very interesting indeed. I certainly learned a lot of things, but there again, I didn't know much about natural capital before the webinar started, so maybe slightly benefiting a lot more there. So we're going to go straight into some questions, if that's okay. If you haven't already done so, now's the time to ask a question using the Q&A function in your toolbars, and we will try and answer as many as we can, but we're hoping to stop at about 1 o'clock. We'll see how that goes. We've probably run over a little bit so far. So we're going to go straight into some questions, and we had some questions before we started when people registered for the webinar. So first question, do we need a stronger mandate to accelerate application and implementation of natural capital?
My answer to that one would be, how much stronger do you need? We know what's going on with climate change. We know what's going on with biodiversity loss. We've got the World Economic Forum announcing things like climate change are the highest threats to our economic and social well-being. The case is there. I think it's more about stopping and trying to understand what are the barriers for you and adopting it. So you can wait for somebody to give you a mandate to do the right thing, but the tools and the guidance is out there, particularly in the UK now, the policy is out there. So get cracking.
Okay, there's the message to go to take home with. Corporations and businesses buying farmland for growing trees and therefore carbon offsetting. Is this a good thing to do? No mention of natural capital, but I guess that's part of it in some way.
Yeah, so it's about, if you've got your asset there, that piece of land, it can be there as farmland to provide you services of food, essentially, or you can have it there to provide you a service of carbon storage and carbon offsetting. These are alternatives. The truth is that there is no black and white, and it's about finding the right thing in the right place. We don't want to create something that's a framework for people to continue to pollute, certainly not. But there are still processes that need to go on. There is going to be a certain level of carbon emissions, particularly whilst we go through a transition period. And so, making sure that we've got that patchwork approach to finding the right thing in the right place, using the tools of natural capital approaches to help you make those decisions is really a great way to go. If you're taking all of these different values into account and then looking at what the options are, working with your local stakeholders to find out if that's the right thing in the right place, then great. Obviously, local food security is always going to be vital, but then so are stemming climate change and biodiversity loss. So finding the right mix is what's important.
Okay, all very much seems to be more of a balancing act and trying to get the right answer for nature, I guess. Okay, I'm going to skip through some more questions. So this is a question regarding the complexities involved. And the example given is, as an air quality professional, is it feasible that I could undertake a natural capital report, or should I look for a specialist or look for specialist support?
I think that's up to you. How much time have you got really to skill yourself up? I would always advocate cross-disciplinary working. So if you're not sure, then work with others. Find other people through things like looking for other chartered environmentalists who can help support you. but I wouldn't let it put you off because you haven't done a master's degree in natural capital and ecosystem services. An awful lot of the guidance, particularly things like that are on ENCA, will walk you through it quite slowly and quite carefully. So you can pick up all of the tools and the guidance and the ways to do things. What's important is that you do recognise your own limits and bring other people on board.
I guess as an environmental professional in a different field, you have a grounding of knowledge. So doing something to do with natural capital is better than not doing it, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. So, you might have a range of different things that are going on in a local area where you've got an air quality problem, where you can increase the amount of natural assets that are there to help clean the air for you, rather than, bring in taxes and tariffs and those kind of things that would control it a different way. So again, finding the right mix for that place and that community.
Okay. Can the intrinsic value we feel for nature be captured in natural capital accounts, i.e. to balance the anthropocentric bias perceived in natural capital approaches?
I'm not sure it's about trying to capture the intrinsic value, because how on earth would you do that? You can make sure that you capture the local voices who can talk passionately about these things, and use that qualitative information alongside any quantitative information in your natural capital assessment. But as I described before, it's about those things existing at the same time. So nature does have a value in and of itself, obviously, it's intrinsic value, but it does have a use and a value to us. So it's about making sure that these things are in balance and that you can represent both. I don't think you should ever try and monetize intrinsic value. I think it's a bit nonsensical, but you can certainly describe it and what it means to people, as well as its value in and of itself. It's not supposed to try and replace ideas of intrinsic value. It's an idea of adding more to the intrinsic value and making sure that that's visible when it comes to land use planning, when it comes to making decisions about what happens where.
Right. Okay. Well, I certainly think that answer should help the person asking that question. Whilst the case for adopting natural capital accounting exists, what examples are there for its practical application in different sectors? I don't think we have time to go through examples, but you mentioned that there was one of the, you were pointing towards a few different places, and I think you said that one of them was full of lots of different case studies. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's case studies of different ways that it's been used in the public sector, available on ENCA. You'll find a whole heap of different case studies through the Ecosystems Knowledge Network, the Natural Capital Coalition. They have a whole bunch of different examples and case studies of how it's been used in the private sector. So again, you will find as well online, you can see the Office for National Statistics UK national natural capital accounts now. So alongside our things like our GDP for indicators of how well we're doing, we now have natural capital accounts so we can see what's happening to our natural resources. It's about creating that visibility to be able to monitor and track these other things which are of huge value to us, but perhaps have been invisible before.
Okay, I'm probably going to finish on this question, and it starts off by saying monetization is not your enemy, neither is it essential. And they said that is such a good quote. And the question is there anywhere in the UK or any councils or programs where it is mandatory to have provided a monetized report on natural capital?
I don't think it's mandatory yet, but certainly bringing in the 25-year environment plan, the UK government has kind of put itself on the line and said that we want to take a natural capital approach to make sure that we are using all of these tools and this way of thinking in order to make sure that we are the first generation to leave the country in a better state than we found it. We're certainly starting to build it in to what we're doing in the Environment Agency. So we have a natural capital account now, which tracks our holdings and our estate and what's happening to that natural capital. And that means because it's there, because it's visible to our leadership, we're now looking at ways to add value to that, whether that's opening up access to different types of sites or using land in different ways to create these multiple benefit values. If you don't measure it or track it, then the risk is always going to be that it's left invisible and then it's given a value of 0. That's the thing that we want to avoid, because that's how we've got to where we are today. So keep looking at different accounts. We're going to be releasing onto Enca as well an account and register tool that will help you to take your first steps into understanding natural capital accounting for your organisation and your business. I can also recommend the DEFRA Pioneers projects to look at how natural capital approaches have been taken at that kind of local authority to regional scale, focusing on a whole range of different ecosystems. So there's a wealth of knowledge out there. Just start digging and exploring, put it down on your CPD, and really sort of explore what's out there. You'll be amazed at the innovation.
Well, that is a brilliant message to end on, I think. So thank you very much again to Vicky. Thank you for spending time with us today and providing some very interesting insights into natural capital. So thank you very much. Before everyone disappears, I just have a few more opportunities you might be interested in, including other things related to natural capital. So as mentioned at the very start of the webinar, this is the first of a 5-part natural capital webinar series. We therefore have 4 more webinars coming up. Part 2 is next week and is all about nature-based solutions. Part 3 looks at the roles of farmers, land managers and consultants. Then we delve into woodland creation and embedding natural capital into strategy in part 4. And to conclude the series, we hear from a member of the Natural Capital Committee who explores the application of natural capital approaches. And that's from Paul Leinster. Free registration is still available for these webinars via the website on your screen at the moment. If you're interested to hear more about CM or RM Tech registration, then check out the How to Become and Why Become recorded webinars on our website. You'll also find all of the recordings from our last series, which is based on biodiversity, which links quite nicely into natural capital. They will be joined by the recording of this webinar very shortly in the coming days. They are also available on the Society for the Environment YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to gain more notifications of new webinar recordings and various other bits of SOCENV content. I am CM. Now, the Chartered Environmentalist community has recently been telling their story to the world about their vital work and why they do it. If you're aspiring to become a CM or an environmental professional more widely, this is a very good place for some very good insight and inspiration from across different sectors, disciplines and continents. And if you are a chartered environmentalist, there is still time to get involved and to tell your story. Search for the hashtag IamCM on Twitter, LinkedIn and YouTube, and you'll find inspiring video clips, interviews, webinars, wise words of advice, and lots more. And you can also head to that web address on your screen now. And that's about it from us today. Thank you very much for listening and taking part. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to gain notifications of new videos, and tap on the thumbs up button. That would be very useful. It helps us spread the word about environmental good practice, which can only be a good thing. Many thanks again to Vicky for the excellent content, and we will see you in the next Natural Capital webinar, which is next week. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe. Over and out from me.